strikes me that we're in a sort of intermediate phase. I've been of the view for some time that they're not going to lock down again. I could be wrong, but that was my view, and a lot of people have been telling me the opposite. But everything they're doing is tentative and seems to be withdrawn relatively quickly to gain influence over people's bodies into the long term, and that, of course, is something we still have to fight. It's not going well because you don't have people on Facebook. I've noticed some people as well, and I've got a connection. I mean, it's pathetic to do it this way, but I've got some connection with people who are on the left who've been like all pro. And now they're starting to talk, well, maybe not vaccine passports, maybe not restriction, maybe it's not, you know. And so I think it's breaking down, the narrative's breaking down, and the narrative has shifted onto the green agenda. The green agenda, I used to think, you know, oh, green, you know, I used to think you're great. And who can't? Who doesn't like nature? But that's not what's discussed here. What's discussed here is that one specific molecule, CO2, which is the gas of life, is responsible for the destruction of life, or will be. Now, I took one example the other day, and I thought I'd look it up. And so the lowest lying country, if you like, it's an archipelago, lots of little islands. It's called the Maldives, and I think it's 2 meters high max. And so I saw that there are lots of stories about the Maldives and how it's going to be underwater. So I thought to myself, well, if sea level's been rising as a consequence of global warming, causing ice sheets to melt, causing the sea to rise, firstly, that has to happen through floating ice, because if it's on, not from floating ice, because floating ice is the same mass as the water, so it wouldn't cause a rise. So it has to be from, like, Greenland, that sort of thing. But then I looked up Maldives, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's watching this, there's no evidence that the Maldives have been inundated with water at any stage in the last 30, 40 years. And I looked up, if you do a search, Maldives, how much has it gone underwater, and stuff like all different variables of that, it comes up with nothing. It comes up with lots of studies saying Maldives will be underwater, but there's nothing about Maldives going underwater now, and that's really odd. I mean, that's when you know that something's strange. And what we're dealing with is models, and computer models. If you run a business and you make what's called a break-even plan, so how much you've got coming in, how much you've got going out, and how do you break even, and how much you borrow, how much you're going to spend, how much your income is, and you can play about with the variables. When you do this, an amazing thing, when you first up a business, you sort of understand the magic of business, because you enter one number early at the beginning and it changes, and you make that number slightly larger. You know, we got 10 customers a day the first day rather than 1 customer a day, and suddenly all the figures and the whole thing change. Now, if you've got variables like the impact of lockdown on mankind, there are millions of variables, in fact billions of variables associated with the consequences of that decision to lock down. And yet, to attempt to make a model that will analyse and conclude correctly what will take place, it's impossible. How you doing, man? It's impossible to do it. At least one that's accurate. You could, of course, retrospectively try and change the results, and then see if that matches the previous decisions that you made about what the inputs would be. But that's what we're working on. The world is based nowadays on artificial intelligence and computer models, and people crunching numbers around these things that have got no connection to reality. And the proof that they've got no connection to reality, in a way, is the physical actions and deeds of those people who are in power, who use these things as their methods. I mean, I listened yesterday, I was on the internet, on Facebook, and then I saw this, Mark Zuckerberg is live, right? So I went on to his live talk, and he was talking such a lot of codswallop. It was the most boring codswallop, trying to explain why he's changed the name of Facebook, or he's going to change the name of Facebook, to Meta. And then there's a picture, you know, there's him with a sort of cartoon 3D character of himself. And everyone's supposed to enter into this sort of, what did they call this one? Second world or something like that, you know, where you have a new identity, and that identity relates to other people. And that this alienated representation like a hologram of yourself, is in circulation around the world, and that you get your satisfaction from that. And that if you can emulate the human being as much as possible, then your satisfaction will come from that. It's a dystopian nightmare. It's madness. But these people are pushing this because they think they can make money out of it, and because people have been scared, they're stuck at home, they're stuck on their phones, and it's become a habit. Like, pull out your phone, pull out your phone, pull out your phone, and so they're assuming that man's trajectory is towards the synergy between man and machine. And ultimately, that's what's pushing the whole of this. It's about, how do you solve it? Well, we provide education online, we provide connection online, you pay love online, you have sex online, you make money online, you know, everything is online, and your human intercommunication is supposed to be is actually mediated by that as well. And so, you know, like me talking to you, talking to a machine, camera, online, you know, this is the way that the technological dystopians who control the world are pushing us. Now, I do think there's a distinction. One of my things I've been studying recently is China. I think we had a discussion about that when we were in Brighton. And what I found is, Adam Tooze published a book called Shutdown, and he's quite a well-known economist at Columbia University who did quite a good book on the big economic crash, 2008. And in this book, there's a lot of, like, he sucks down and swallows all the mainstream narrative, but there's also an important component on China, and in there he shows with references what Xi Jinping was saying, the leader in China. And he was saying, although they locked down on the 23rd of January 2020, by the 10th of February, Xi Jinping had called for reopening. So within 3 weeks, he wanted to reopen. That's because they knew the incubation period was a maximum of 10 days, and they hadn't had a huge outbreak. And so he said, reopen. In other words, it isn't what we thought it was. Now, the reason why the Chinese locked down in the first place, and I've been doing a lot of studying on this the last week, is that there's something in China called yin now, and it means medical unrest. It means medical mobs, medical malpractice mobs. And what it is, you go to a hospital in China, you get treated according to how much money you've got. So if you don't have any money, you get treated shit. And if you get treated shit, then people complain, because that's a way of making money. And people know if their family or friend dies, if you go to the hospital and protest, the hospital will pay you money, compensation. And because of that, the main focus for social unrest in the urban areas in China has been medicine for many, many years, and hospitals. There have been many cases, they went about Debbie Hicks going to one hospital in England, they trying to arrest her and charge her with all these sort of things, causing a disturbance in the hospital. People go, oh no, how can you protest in the hospital? In China, all these people say, oh, I don't agree with the Chinese government, don't agree with it. In China, protests take place at hospitals on a daily basis. And when you go to hospitals, there are people standing outside there who will protest for you. You can pay them to protest, right? Or they'll make a contact with a doctor for you, so that's a bribe. Or they'll jump in the queue for you. So if you want to go to hospital, you jump in front of the queue. There's some guy who's a scalper who you pay money, let's say £100, and he'll get you to see the doctor. And so there's a price, and people are enraged at this, that the doctors take bribes, and that the whole thing's a sort of money-making scheme. So the consequence of that is that, for example, quite often there are battles between people who are protesting and medical staff. So they go to hospital. Like, there was one case in Shanghai, I think 10 people were stabbed in the hospital, 10 doctors were stabbed in the hospital. Another case where the doctors and nurses all fought back physically against the people. Obviously, sometimes they will be right, sometimes they will be wrong. But the distrust is so strong in China about hospitals that this is why they locked down. It's because when they thought there was a disease coming, a new disease that might kill quite a few people suddenly, what would happen if they left everything open and people protested? The other thing was that they said, we're going to give all treatment free. So everybody who had any ailment, no more queues, you go to hospital, you get in. So there were these scenes of like thousands of people in Wuhan at the hospitals waiting to be seen, right? Why? Because it was free treatment, so it was your first chance to go and get treatment for lung cancer or whatever else you got. And so this is what caused the combination of factors that led the Chinese to lock down. Plus there was this campaign in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and that sort of thing, which all integrated together with this. So when they removed the lockdown, the proof of this is that when they removed the lockdown in China after 72 days, There has never been another national lockdown in China. In fact, there never was a national lockdown in China. A lot of China, Hong Kong, for example, never locked down, you know. And a lot of other provinces never locked down. So in those areas, particularly Hubei was the main area where they did lock down, they never locked down again. There's a lockdown now in Lanzhou, in the north of China, and some lockdown of some area of Beijing. But if you compare that, for example, with Australia or New Zealand, where they've been pretty much in and out of lockdown for a year and a half, and Britain, where we've been in and out of lockdown for a year and a half, it's indicative that actually, mad as it sounds, the Chinese have been freer than we have throughout this whole period. I mean, only a short period of time where they were locked down like that. Now, a lot of people tell me about the social credit system and all that, which it is bad the way they do things. But the thing that's not really different here. You go to the supermarket here and you use a credit card. It's connected into the whole industry of whatever you're purchasing. So all those are records, and those records are stored on databases that are the battleground of the world. You know, I had a look at it yesterday. They want all this. First of all, you start to sign up for this app thing, blah, 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 and then they said they want you to fucking give a video message where you read out numbers. Oh, I'm not bloody giving any video message, read out numbers for these fuckers, you know, because then they got like all this profile of you, which they can sell, and it's all about profiles, you know, calculations of the adjustments to. I was looking at a discussion about that yesterday, and they make these trees that are supposedly connected together in time. So if you got one type, let's say this type, and that one's got this type with that little amendment, then they assume because that one came after that one came from the other. But actually, you could look at the German spread and the Chinese spread and the Korean spread and the English spread, and of course it's all about the numbers of samples they take. You could trace those in any direction. So there's nothing to say that something that comes afterwards isn't a progenitor of something that came before, because that could have circulated in a different direction around the world. It could have circulated through man to an animal, for example, to a mink, and a mink to a human. So anyway, the point is about data game, you know what I mean? Who controls the future of data? Now, Facebook has had an enormous collapse recently, which is an illustration of a battle going on in the world, not only between the tech companies, but also between other companies in the economy and the big tech companies. Those who've lost out in the big pandemic orgy of accumulation, such that about 10 companies in the world have got a bigger economy now than the United States of America, and bigger influence actually, because the interconnections with everyone in the world that Google's got and Facebook got, it can't even be dreamt about by the Chinese government or the British government. And so I cannot believe that the blackout of Facebook, I think 2 weeks ago, was accidental. I think someone was directly sabotaging them. And then the next day there was the whistleblower coming out with typical sort of, I mean, they were coming out with stuff that was aimed at the general consensus viewpoint, that hate, crime. And so there's a giant game going on above our heads by the big tech companies as to who controls the world, and other companies are fighting against them as well. And now where they do have a common unity is that they all want large amounts of public funds to go towards so-called climate change resolutions. So that's why the COP26 game's going on. The whole world is supposed to focus on this, and there's a direct correlation. You get the increase in climate change news, and the climate change news is intended to, because they know they've got a majority on this. Everyone's so ignorant about climate, and it's so natural to think, oh, that's such a shit day today. Can't have been like this a year ago. I mean, any year in the history of the world, on the same day, you're going to have different climate. You've never had the same weather on the same day in the year, or the same time of day in the year, ever, in the history of the world, anywhere in the world. And then someone, whenever I discuss these things, people go, you never get snow in the Sahara. So I looked up on the internet, do you get snow in the Sahara? Boom, snow in the Sahara, right? You do get snow in the Sahara once in a while, you know, and you get like 40 degrees once in a while somewhere, you know, you get a highest temperature somewhere in some little valley, and they never measured it before. Where were all the temperature measurements in 1850? They talk about, oh, climate's changed since 1850. Well, how many climate points of control did they have in 1850? And how accurate were they compared with what we got now? And if you compare those things, if you only compared the exact locations, and how would you do it? If you're going to measure the temperature around here, so you've got to gauge measuring temperature in Hyde Park corner. They might well have had that 150 years ago. But we didn't have any cars in 1850. And so the temperature will be affected by the surface temperatures around here. If you say it's satellite, well, then there's other factors affect, temperatures a mile up, mile and a half up, and so on. And so we don't actually, the idea that they've got a perfect mechanism for checking how the temperature has risen and how that's correlated to CO2 is just nonsense. And I used to think it might be true, but then I discussed with peers, I discussed with others, I've done research, I looked into it. The evidence is threadbare, and yet they all swear it's true. And when they swear it's true, they say it's scientific consensus. Well, there's a scientific consensus that the capitalist economic system is wonderful for the world and always has been. There was a scientific consensus in the 16th century that witches should be burnt at the stake. There was a scientific consensus in up until 1860s that the world had been made in 6 days by God. 4004 BC, at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 20th of October or thereabouts. That was the scientific consensus. Bishop Ussher was the authority on it. Anybody who disagreed with him was a heretic. And so, why do we assume that we know now for sure the truth? We don't. We can approximate truth, but the method they use, what they call science, what passes for science nowadays, is not even an attempt to approximate truth. It's a postulate and then a reinforcement of that postulate by multiple agencies all getting the funding. Suddenly there were hundreds of millions of pounds available at a week's notice. All you had to do was submit an application, 150 words long, or 500 words long, sorry, and they would give you an answer where they would fund you for scientific research on the question within a week. No scientific funding gets passed within a week normally. And so suddenly there were all these bloody people around the world. I do a walking tour, and the walking tour, suddenly people come up and say, "What's your job?" They said, "I was working in climate. I was working in pharmaceuticals. I was working in economics." Investigations they were doing were channeled by the research that was funded, and therefore it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The so-called consensus is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start out with a proposition, you fund everyone to look into that proposition, and then you say, "Oh look, everyone agrees to the proposition," because the funding's gone that direction anyway. So it's fraudulent in that way, and of course once you're doing that yourself, you've got no reason to question it, and that's what's that's the trickery of the game. And the problem is of course that's also been pushed by artificial intelligence now. So it's a self-replicating process. They automatically reproduce the information that corresponds with the artificial intelligence data, which they inputted in certain models that produce those results automatically. And so, you can't escape from the madness. But they can escape from one type of madness. So, for example, it wasn't artificial intelligence at the time, but when they came out with this stuff about, the Iraq War, we had Colin Powell, he had a powder thing, shook it around, and sadly he died. But shook up the little tin in the United Nations, and off they went to war, dropped the bombs. I thought they'd turn up with weapons of mass destruction just because they could find it, but they didn't. So, although it was a conspiracy to invade Iraq, they didn't conspire sufficiently to produce chemical weapons at the end of it, even though that was the justification. And then nobody was ever put in trial for what they did. And so I suspect that's what's going to happen here. These so-called investigations are going to drag on and drag on and drag on. In 15 years or 10 years' time, when they come up with their conclusions from the investigations, they'll conclude that actually it was, the facts that we know. And that always heresy to say that, but it's been published now, and so we know this to be fact. And yet, they will publish this in 10 years' time and say, "Oh, look, we found that out, and we didn't know at the time, and it seemed to be so serious and so deadly, and therefore we had to do what we did. And all the intentions were right." And that's always the excuse. When the police, for example, if they arrest you, and then you want to do them for false arrest, the police can turn around and say, I genuinely believed at the time that was what was happening. And that's grounds enough, even if the action was illegal, because he genuinely believed at the time that what he was doing was legally allowed or right. And so this is the way they get around it. And that's just a little police officer. But if you've got the whole system, which is engaged in a global campaign of transformation, then of course you have to justify it. And the way you justify it is to push the narrative sufficiently so that nobody questions it, and then when it finally is exposed at the end, nobody's bothered anymore because it's 10 years on, and we've moved on from that, and who gives a fuck? And there's something else come up. What's come up? Climate change. And then when climate change doesn't happen, and it won't happen, climate change always happens, that's the point. It was never climate change, it was global warming. Global warming has now become climate change. Climate change has now become adverse weather events. Adverse weather events is an impossibility not to have an adverse weather event. There's no such thing as having it's not like porridge in the Three Bears, not too hot, not too cold. There's always unusual weather. It's the very nature of our planet and the sun and the constellations of the cosmos that temperatures vary. There are flares on the sun that burst out. It's a gigantic ball of fire, and everyone knows that governs. Everyone knows, it's a sunny day, great, I'm going to sit in the sun. You don't say, climate change is going to be that, and therefore if it's in the sun, it's going to be too hot, or if it's the temperature's 12 degrees and the sun's shining, you're fine, and there's no wind, you can sit in the sun. These are just elements. Every child knows that. Funny thing was, I was watching a video, which was a lecture by Sir Fred Hoyle. He's one of the leading cosmologists in the world, and he invented the term Big Bang. He doesn't agree with Big Bang, but he invented the term. He doesn't think it's true. But he's dead now, Sir Fred Hoyle. And I listened to a lecture he gave in Sri Lanka yesterday, and a very interesting point he made, which I can't remember what it was now. Basically, he was saying that what was it? I can't bloody remember what it was now. Slipped my mind. So what was I saying? I can't remember. Slipped my mind. Terribly sorry. Anyway, it's well worth watching. Fred Hoyle. He was basically saying that the universe is alive. It's not just life on Earth. That there are bacteria and viruses in meteorites. And when meteorites strike Earth, they're disseminated across the world. Now, I don't know if this theory is true, but it's a viable theory. And he says that there's no evidence that the primordial soup, in other words, that the combination of minerals and liquids which can form in, or could have formed on Earth with some cooling down of the temperature of the Earth, that has ever led, there's no example where you can show that having some primordial soup produces life. And therefore he's saying, and I don't know if it's true, but he's saying that that the universe is full of life, and that under certain conditions life forms into certain forms. And I think that might well be a reasonable channel for investigation as to these questions. But the point is, there isn't a closed science. There's no such thing, there never has been. Any closed science is religion, and that's what we got now. We got religions. So it says here, this was Karl Marx, 1842. Under constant medical tutelage, life would be regarded as an evil, and the human body as an object for treatment by medical institutions. Is not death more desirable than life, that is, a mere preventative measure against death? Does not life involve also free movement? What is an illness except life that is hampered in its freedom? And there you have, in essence, exactly what we had in the last year. The intervention that said that monitoring and controlling life is more important than having a life. And for old people, if you're 85, every month of your life is a year compared with a young person. And therefore, all these restrictions were stealing their lives.